Hello everyone. So I am fascinated by true crime. I haven't read a lot of true crime novels, but I really want to, and that is what I'm going to try to do. I want to read a lot of true crime novels and report on them, and not just do book reviews, but give you details and how the author went about writing the book. I guess this will have spoilers even though it's real life, but if you want to learn about the events from the books, then I suggest not watching this. I won't be discussing every detail, so I think reading the book also is a good idea. The first case I will be discussing is the Clutter family murders, as discussed in True Blood by Truman Capote. This will have details about their death, so if you find those things disturbing, then I suggest not watching this. So let's get started. On November 15th, 1959, 4 members of the Clutter family, Herb Clutter, 48, his wife Bonnie Clutter, 45, their daughter Nancy Clutter, 16, and their son Kenyon Clutter, 15, were murdered in a small farming community in Holcomb, Kansas. Their 2 eldest daughters, Beverly and Ivana, were luckily not home. They had moved out at this point. They were found the next day by Nancy's best friend, Susan Kidwell. The police was immediately called. Mitchell Geisler, the chief of police, and Assistant Chief Rich Rolander were first on the scene. Herb Clutter was found on a mattress in the basement. He was stabbed, his throat was cut, and he was shot in the head. His hands were bound and his mouth was taped. In the adjoining room, they found Kenyon. He was shot in the head and gagged. Upstairs in each of their bedrooms, they found Nancy and Bonnie. Both have been bound and shot in the head. The only evidence they were able to retrieve were a bloody boot print and tire marks. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation, led by Alvin Dewey, got involved, and they weren't able to find much until a former prisoner, Floyd Wells, ratted out the murderers for ransom money that was being offered. And the KBI gathered evidence to corroborate Floyd's story. The murderers turned out to be Perry Smith and Richard Hitchcock. Floyd and Richard used to be in prison together, where Floyd told Richard about his former employee, Herb Clutter. And he told Richard that Herb was very wealthy and kept about like $10,000 in a safe at their house. And this information cracked the whole case wide open. Perry and Richard walked into the Clutter house with a shotgun and a knife. They woke up Herb and demanded to see the safe. Of course, Herb denied the existence of the safe because they didn't really have one, and this angered the 2 men, and they decided to kill the entire family because they didn't want any witnesses. They ransacked the house and left with about $50, binoculars, and a transistor radio. Immediately after the murders, Hitchcock and Smith fled to Kansas City, where Hitchcock wrote a series of hot checks. After that, they fled to Mexico, where they pawned the binoculars, where they hitchhiked to California, to Nebraska. In Nebraska, they stole a car, where then they went to Kansas City again, then to Florida, and eventually Nevada. It was in Nevada that they were finally captured. The KBI caught them December 31st, 1959. When they were captured, they still had the boots from where they made the bloody boot print, and they were interrogated, and once they confessed, they were flown from Nevada to Garden City, where they stood trial. On March 29th, 1960, a jury of all men found them guilty and recommended the death penalty. For the next 5 years, they stayed on death row at a federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. They were executed by hanging on the gallows of the prison on April 14th, 1965. Hitchcock was pronounced dead at 12:41 a.m. and Smith at 1:19 a.m. Truman Capote was 35, and he already achieved a lot of fame from his fiction works like Breakfast at Tiffany's. Capote first learned about this case in the New York Times. He stumbled across a small article about a family in a farming town being murdered, and he knew this was a story he always wanted to write. Accompanied by his childhood friend Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, made their way to Kansas to investigate the Clutter family murder. He wasn't really welcomed by the community. They didn't trust him, and they weren't sure of his motives, but eventually he gained the trust from the KBI, and they allowed him to even interview the murderers. At first, Smith and Hitchcock weren't really trusting of him. They didn't really tell him anything. It took about 4 or 5 months for them to start opening up to Capote, but the last 5 years while they were on death row was when they were really honest with him and they told him everything. During their time, Perry tells Capote that he didn't really have anything against the Clutter family, that they didn't do anything to him. It was just all that pent up anger from all the other people treating him badly, that they just had to pay for it. Capote and the murderers stayed in close contact. Capote would write letters to them about twice a week. In Cold Blood started as a series for the New Yorker, but eventually it became a book, and Perry and Hitchcock both knew that Capote was going to write a book. Capote even gave things that he was writing to them to look over. The only complaint that Perry had was that he didn't like the title, since he said the crimes were not done in cold blood. Capote had a really hard time writing this book because he knew in order for the book to be finished, they would have to be executed, and Capote was even with them for their last hour before execution. And after the killers were executed, the conflict that Capote was feeling tore him apart. In Cold Blood was published in 1966, and it became a national bestseller, and it is even considered to be one of the first true crime novels. After In Cold Blood was published, Capote fell on hard times. His drinking got a lot worse, and he turned to drugs. A quote by Capote says, "If I had realized then what the future held, I never would have stopped in Garden City. I would have driven straight on like a bat out of hell." So writing this book and researching it for 6 years or more really took a toll out of him. So I highly recommend this book, especially if you like true crime. Capote recreated dialogue which really made it seem like a novel. This was controversial when it was first published because it didn't seem like a nonfiction book, especially in the beginning when they were talking about the Clutter family. The detail to this book is incredible. It showed how invested Capote was to this case. Capote spent hours interviewing everyone involved. He sat down with the killers, and he developed a personal relationship with them, and it really showed. It was written very well, and the pacing was very good. It was divided into 4 sections. The first section was about the Clutter family. We got to meet them and see what they did right before they died, which made it very sad because we got attached even though we knew what was about to happen to them. The second part was about the investigation and how the townspeople were affected. Part 3 is we found out why this happened and what the murderers were doing after they killed the Clutter family. And the fourth part is about the trial and execution. So I really do think that this is an excellent book. There are parts that I felt very unnecessary because the level of detail is extreme. Some parts I thought I just didn't need to know. But he did spend so much time with this case. But my main problem I had with this book is his portrayal of the killers. I do like getting into the minds of the killers. That's why I like true crime so much. But I feel that the victims should be the main focus. And I know I'm guilty of this. I can name a lot of serial killers, but I can't name the victims. And that depresses me because I think the victims should be remembered and not the killers. And I think at times Capote wanted you to have sympathy for the killers, especially Perry. He got really close to Perry. However, I know it isn't all biased towards Perry because he did write where you got to see Perry's dark side, and I especially liked that because it showed how that even though Perry had a bad life, that his actions were his fault. And in this book, and you can tell how close Capote got to this story, which is a good thing and a bad thing. So let me know in the comments below what books you think I should read and report on next. So like and subscribe, and I'll see y'all later. Bye!